Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for taking time out of your day to spend about an hour with us. I hope that you'll enjoy this session, and we're going to have some fun today. But my name is Mindy Hunthrop, and I am a program coordinator and academic advisor for the Master of Science in Operations Management program here at the University of Arkansas. So I just wanted to let all of you know that this webinar is part of a series that is presented by the Operations Management program. That's why we call it the MSOM Lunch and Learn webinar series. But we do have 3 online master's degree options. So if you're interested in anything you see on your screen now, we've got an engineering degree, an engineering management, and of course the Operations Management program. So we'll get started, and I'll let you know a little bit about Jim so you'll know who you're going to be hearing from for about the next hour or so. So today's presenter is Jim Sutton, and he is an adjunct professor for the MSOM program with over 30 years of experience in software and systems leadership roles. World-leading aerospace, banking, finance, media, and software firms have used Jim's services in transforming themselves. Recognitions at the highest levels have followed, including the Shingo Prize, which I think is really cool. Business Week has called that Shingo Prize the Nobel Prize of Manufacturing. He also was awarded the exclusive INCOSE ESEP designation, of which only a few hundred have been awarded worldwide. Jim co-authored a book called Lean Software Strategies in 2005 that applies lean principles to software development. In 2009, Jim co-founded the Lean Systems Society, which is a multidisciplinary organization of lean systems thought leaders. He later became president of this organization, where he served in that role for 3 years from 2012 to 2015. So for the last 2 years, what has Jim been up to? He's been consulting many of the world's largest banking, media, software development organizations on transformation using, of course, lean and agile principles and tools. Today, he applies these hard-won lessons to helping motivated leaders improve their programs and organizational infrastructures. He also teaches a couple of courses for the MSOM program, and those classes are quality management and leadership principles. If you like what you see today, you might choose Jim as your teacher when you register for classes if you're in the program. So what you'll hear about today is kind of a snapshot of how Jim was able to apply his experience with lean principles to personal and professional effectiveness through this new tool called ViRAL, Visible Reality for an Actionable Life. At the end of the presentation, we will open up the floor for questions. So we'll ask that you kind of save your questions as we move through the presentation and then put them in the chat box at the end of the presentation when we open that up. And for now, I will turn it over to Jim.
Thanks, Mindy. Hi, everyone. So originally, I was going to share more of a typical operations management topic, but I've been working for several months now on something that's very important to me personally. And when I shared it with some of the faculty and leaders in the department, they encouraged me to make it my topic for this webinar. So come along with me on a journey today, a journey I've been on for the better part of a year and devoted myself to for the last 3 months. This journey started with me taking stock of my life, something you no doubt have done of yourself at times. And the stock I took started with the things I still want to accomplish. I realized I have much more I want to do now than I have done to this point. I imagine you do as well. After that, I took stock of where I was and how I was moving forward. And I saw in the cold, hard light of day that what I've been doing will not get me where I want to go, ever. So I started thinking, what can I do to go further on this path? And it could not just be a little bit further. It would have to be a quantum leap to bridge that gap. And I had tried all sorts of improvement approaches over my adult life. Personal planner systems of all kinds, professional, personal coaching, techniques that I read in books, and they all helped, just not nearly enough. I couldn't seem to force myself to stay with them for various reasons, including cost. Some of these things are very expensive, as you know. Boredom, but most importantly, ineffectiveness. because what's the point if they're not getting the job done? So I started digging back into my toolkit of approaches for organizational improvement, looking for what might help someone accomplish their personal goals. I drew upon topics like lean, agile, cognition, decision theory, complexity theory, and others. And I found pieces from all of these, but none by themselves gave me what I needed. However, together, several of them seemed to hold promise. They let me make a fascinating game out of my own life, hence the picture on this slide. I picked this particular picture because in it, the board itself evolves, like our lives evolve and adapt. So I put together a prototype, and from there I began using and refining it step by step. I will tell you this at this point, I don't ever expect to not use this system or something evolved from it again. What you're going to see today is still immature, incomplete, and evolving right up to this minute. I'm sharing this with you because you may have a similar desire to mine to make your life count for as much as you can in whatever time you have on this earth. I hope that even if the ViRAL system does not suit your purposes as is, something you will see today will help you with your journey. So let's do this together. You are free to use this for any purpose but commercial development. Now I'm going to turn the camera off and we'll just proceed through the slides. That's the picture I was alluding to. Sorry, I did not realize it was not up. All right. Let's think of if the purpose of all of this is to accomplish more with a life, let's think of accomplishment like a glass of water. How much you can get of it depends on several things. First of all, the size of the glass that you make. So what is this glass exactly? Oops, let's go back. It's the total amount of work that we can accomplish in a day. And as Police Chief Brody and Jaws said, we're going to need a bigger boat. So we need more capacity in the day. Secondly, for a given size of glass or a given capacity, how much can we fill that glass? Well, what do we mean by filling it? If water is meaningful accomplishment and the rest of the glass is low value activity, that's really what we're talking about. So you could say that this dimension is about improving our discernment of what's most important and acting on that discernment. You know, a few succinct questions that sort of sum this up. That meaningful accomplishment is measured in impact. A third dimension is how much energy it takes us to fill the glass. So it may look like it takes less energy to fill on the left side with the dropper, but after you've put about 50,000 drops into that glass, all of a sudden it becomes obvious that there's faster ways to fill the glass. If you can do more on the same amount of energy, you have just increased your capacity. And finally, joy makes a huge difference in how much you can do. And research shows that people who have lost their joy in work or life can often regain it, much of it, by spending 15 minutes, just 15 minutes a day, if it's a daily habit. We'll talk a little bit about that to come. So, I'm calling the ViRAL system a life operations environment rather than a personal planner, because it needs to do so much more than a personal planner can do. You'll see what I mean as we go along. To improve in the 4 ways we've just listed, what must this kind of environment support? Well, to increase our total capacity, one way to do that is to live a balanced life, what some people would call a balanced life. So here's this quote from Bell Atlantic, that learning is not all about the head. It involves the whole body and mind, its emotions, senses, and receptors. And note here that for Bell Atlantic, the result of that was that their employees became much more productive, much more accomplishment. There's plenty of research that shows that this is true. Here we go. For instance, this study by University of British Columbia found that regular physical exercise increased the size of the hippocampus, which is involved in verbal, memory, and learning. Now, what was needed to do that? Well, a half an hour most days of the week, 150 minutes a week. That's 5 30-minute sessions a week. Now, the trick is to keep up that kind of consistency over several months and even more. And the ViRAL system supports that kind of discipline, and it's enabled me to be consistent with exercise over the last several months for the first time in my life. Oops. Here we go. Okay, secondly, what must we do to increase our total capacity? Well, we have to handle both tasks in developing of capabilities. What do I mean by that? Well, let's look at just one current state-of-the-art approach, which is JSIDS. This is in the military world, Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System. It's an acquisition guideline. And what it does is, prior to JSIDS, which came out in the early 2000s, the government focused only on tasks. What they focused on was future threats and systems to address them. And what they found was both there was a lot of redundancy between different branches of the military, and there was also oftentimes the failure to anticipate situations that came up in the world. So they discovered that just having a focus on missions, and this is missions in the military sense of a set of actions aimed at a particular result, defined result, was not sufficient. So JSIDS came along and developed the capabilities side, which is to fill gaps to handle general or unanticipated needs. And those capabilities can benefit many missions, including ones that were not anticipated. Now, interestingly enough, W. Edwards Deming, in point number 13 of his 14 points, said this: encourage education and self-improvement. Now, in this point, he is not talking about training for a specific job. He's talking about a general personal development. In other words, increasing the capability of employees. He has another point, number 6, in which he addresses job-specific training. So, where do capabilities come from? And where they come from is habits. We'll define habits as being repeated practices. So, a life operations environment like ViRAL must make it easier to have good habits than to not have good habits. So this system I've been working on supports starting and sustaining good habits. That's something that none of the personal planners I've tried have done, including GTD, Franklin Covey, TRO, and others. It's one of the reasons I started developing ViRAL for myself. I also looked into gamification planners, which are planners that are based on game theory, as they do support formation of habits. In fact, they make it almost addictive. The ones I've been able to find thus far, though, lack support for life accomplishment, so they're not strategic, and they don't have that aspect. So here's an interesting body of work. This fellow, Brendan Burchard, has done a lot of research, thousands of people, especially people that we would define as high performers, you know, CEOs, successful doctors, athletes, pretty much you name it, and has extracted from that the common factors across almost all high performers. And what it boils down to is a specific set of practices. In other words, habits. And for the word success there, I prefer the word accomplishment. To sum it up, success or accomplishment boils down to just a few simple disciplines practiced every day. But the rub is, how do we keep those up, right? We're notoriously bad as human beings at sustaining habits over the long term. And that's where an environment can be helpful. As humans, we want to start with anything but why, because thinking about why is a lot of work. So much better to jump into a plan and start executing. The only problem is that's a sure way to get a lot done of lower value things. If we're going to accomplish more, why is exactly where we must start. Now, we're not going to play this TED Talk. I highly recommend, though, you look it up. It's life-changing. There's a short version, a 5-minute version, and a long version, which I think is around 12 minutes. But as you can see, this starts with why. So in this kind of environment, we start by identifying life purposes. There are multiple ways to explore this, and it is too big a topic to get into in this webinar. But you already know many of your own whys anyway. On my own personal reboot this year, why is where I started. So beginning in that middle circle, our whys or purposes help us identify our hows, which are our strategies for accomplishing those purposes. And our hows or strategies suggest missions we may undertake. Again, I'm using the word mission here in a military sense, a set of actions we take to fulfill a strategy. Those actions that go into the missions we call tasks. So you can follow the arc from why to how to what to tasks. Those are purpose-driven tasks. Our missions, however, can also suggest that we need to develop some general capabilities, and that's where the dashed line shows from missions to capabilities. Say we have a purpose to help people around the world, so we create a strategy to build a life overseas so we can better understand them. And from that, we get a mission to be a manager in an international company's offices. To ever be able to achieve that mission, we may need a capability in a foreign language. So we pick a language for best effect, and then we practice it with a habit. Notice everything in this is intentional. It is directed towards accomplishing what we care most about. At the end of the talk, if you're interested, ask me about spontaneity. For now, I'll just say the ViRAL system enhances that. As I said, this system, as I'm evolving, as I'm using it, this is a board that I've just started using for my own golden circle work. So notice I have stickies. This is an 11 by 17 sheet of paper, which goes nicely on a wall, or since I don't have a wall handy where I'm working, I put it on a 2-foot by 3-foot cork board on a stand. I cleaned up this picture for this presentation. I had around 20 stickies on the board before. Even so, the print's small on the screen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip to a chart that shows this in a more readable form. The shaded area are the stickies that you just saw on that chart. So I have a high-level purpose that I want to help people accomplish more of what matters to them in their lives. And let's follow down the left side. So one strategy I have for doing that is to develop a personal life operations environment. Initially, it was for myself. It started working well enough that I elevated it to being a strategy for this higher level purpose. Now notice there's two missions that I show here coming out of that strategy. One mission is this webinar. The other mission is to optimize the time box board that you'll be seeing in a minute. Now from the mission to develop this webinar, I had one task, which is to write the script. Now, it's not a literal script. I'm not reading everything. But it is more like a storyline. But I felt I needed some more capabilities. So one thing I did was go buy the book by the head of TED. And this is certainly not a TED Talk, but some of the techniques that I learned there have fed back into the work of preparing for this webinar. We'll see more about this slide a little bit later. Now, certainly the most important way to identify what tasks we want to do in our lives and what capabilities we need to develop in our lives, certainly the strongest entry point for that is the golden circle. However, there's a couple of major entry points that are not in the golden circle directly that are still important to us and that we need to keep in mind. So one is for capabilities that the values that we have. Now, values differ from purposes in that they are general foundations that aren't specific. So, for instance, you might think that it's important to give balanced attention to all aspects of your life, like we said earlier on the earlier slide. So you give daily attendance to your physical needs, like eating healthy and exercising, your mental development, like personal improvement and perspective, and your spiritual side, like prayer or meeting the needs of others. Those are value-driven habits that do not trace directly back to any missions. Unless, of course, you're a Navy SEAL, and then these may actually be derived from your missions. Likewise, for tasks, we have other ways that tasks can come up besides purposes. So I have called these promises and pop-ups, and this has come out of just living my life using this system here recently. Promises are things that you commit to do that are not primarily purpose-driven. For instance, you agree to take your neighbor's dog to a grooming appointment because she said she had to wait months to get in, but an emergency just came up. You do this task because your friendship is important to you and because you said yes, it was a promise. But it doesn't come from some top-level purpose like you're wanting to see all dogs looking neat and clean. Also, how often have we done things because we've just been cleverly manipulated into them? All you can say at that point, maybe it's a point of honor to do what you said you would do, and there's a lesson to learn to avoid it in the future. Now, pop-ups are kind of what's left over. It's just life poking its hand up and saying, here I am. For instance, if you have a son, maybe your son just backed the car into the neighbor's mailbox, and now you have to go repair it. These are interruptions outside of purposes and promises. Our third area is the energy it takes to accomplish a given, or to do a given amount of accomplishment. One of the main ways the brain uses up large amounts of body energy is in decision making. So we will start with that. Interesting factoid, the brain is approximately 2% of human body mass, but it uses 20% of metabolic energy. As you can see from this thermogram, it shows relative energy flow in different areas. Now, if we can get more accomplished out of the same amount of energy expended, that's a big win. Let's see why it matters. There's something called decision fatigue, which occurs. We're actually expending energy and fatiguing the brain as we make more and more decisions. This chart shows rulings by judges on parole judges on the paroles that come up before them. And as you see, there are more favorable decisions on parole early in the session. As the session goes on, this is based on real data from a number of judges, quite a big sample of judges. As they look at more and more cases, the amount of paroling that goes on goes down. Now, there's several possible explanations, but one is just they're getting tired and it takes a lot of energy to think about it, and it's just easier to say no. However, interestingly enough, when they have a meal break and they come back, they have recovered some of that energy and their paroling is at a higher level. Again, it degrades. And as many times as you go through that cycle, each time it starts lower and ends up very, very short, very small. So one thing we need to do if we're going to get more out of the energy that the brain power, the brain energy we use, is to have a system that helps us make decisions. Dr. Parnell has a career worth of outstanding decision-making techniques, a lot of hard-won wisdom. Much of what he talks about is applicable for very large decisions up to the scale of nations. But some of them can be adapted to work on personal scale decisions. I've done some of that myself over the years. So that's a technique we can use. Now, out of all that energy that's just flying out of our heads, and by the way, that's why your mom probably told you to put on a hat when you went outside in the winter, just to hold some of that in. But out of all that is flowing out, your unconscious mind is using the majority of it, according to this brain researcher. So if we want to get more out of the energy we're putting into thought, one of the things we have to do is address our subconscious. Now, one of the main jobs of our subconscious is to protect us from harm. One of the main ways it does that is by visualizing bad outcomes to troubling situations that fill us with fear. Because if we're fearful enough of something, we won't do it. That works great when the threat is like a wild animal and you need motivation to get away safely. Unfortunately, the subconscious doesn't distinguish between things that could really hurt you and things that won't and could actually help you, but are not familiar and thus are suspect, like learning a new skill or speaking publicly. Some ways to bring your subconscious back in line with your conscious, a couple of ideas. This could be, again, a whole webinar. One thing we can do, though, is just speak aloud what we know to be truth and contradict falsehoods like fears, inappropriate fears from our subconscious. Another way is to limit task switching. So there is a mental overhead when we switch tasks. Just like in a computer, when you switch tasks, there's effort expended in moving out what was there previously and moving in the new thing. And if you've been working on it previously, getting caught back up to where you were before. So we need some sort of an environment that can handle our task switching. And one of the main causes of task switching is multitasking. Again, huge body of work in the last few years shows that multitasking is not a good thing, and that the people who think that they're the best at multitasking actually suffer the most from it. Work out of Stanford in particular, if you want to Google it. So the answer here is limit our multitasking. Another thing, and this comes also out of queuing theory and lean, is that work in process. Something called Little's Law relates the amount of work in process to a slowed down throughput. And a lot of that comes from task switching. So again, we want to limit our whip. So this statement kind of sums it up. In fact, where you see the word power, you could substitute the word accomplishment. Having our brain in a state of relaxation uses less energy than our brain does in a state of tenseness. And this finally is one of the key concepts in lean, is simply to make everything visible. And it makes sense, right? Because if you have to keep things in your head and juggle them up there that are invisible, then that's going to take effort. Whereas if you can get the things that matter into a visible form, then you don't have to hold all of that in your brain. And furthermore, it makes it much easier to make decisions. Okay, the last thing, getting more joy. So the joy that we get from accomplishing things, one way to get that is to get into a state of psychological flow. That isn't actually a formal term, as we'll see. Deming said that one of management's main jobs is to create a system that people can find joy in. So how prevalent is that in industry today? And yet it's supposed to be at the center because it has a great effect on accomplishment, productivity, as well as satisfaction. Now, this thing that we're calling psychological flow produces joy. It has been clinically observed. There's a fellow named Csikszentmihalyi, who is an Eastern European, who is a professor emeritus in Chicago, who's done virtually all of the founding work on this. It's been called the world's leading authority on positive psychology. And getting in a state of psychological flow is a state of concentration or complete absorption. If you look at the thing on the right, one thing you can say about it, my definition for psychological flow is it's the state when you're using the most of your capabilities, doing something you find challenging and worthwhile. A good example we have of this is the 2-minute drill in football. And so if you've ever seen a game where a team has just sort of stalled all the way through the game, and then we get to the last 2 minutes, they go into a 2-minute drill, and then all of a sudden, there's no huddle, everybody just knows what they're doing, and they go into this hyper state of consciousness and activity, and all of a sudden they start scoring, and sometimes they even win. That is psychological flow. And in fact, a lot of professional teams use Csikszentmihalyi as a consultant to help them operate more in a state of psychological flow. It's possible to build a flow environment. Montessori is based on that idea, but it requires work to set it up. So we're going to look at some work I've done. I've experienced a lot more flow since I've started using this system. And but I'm just forewarning you, I don't want you to get your hopes up too high on fit and finish. I've been putting all my effort into getting the system to work, so it's not going to be the prettiest thing you've ever seen. The important thing to me is it works. So here is the time box board I mentioned earlier. It's on an 11 by 17 piece of paper, and we'll go through what the elements are for shortly. I use Sharpie markers. I take 3 by 3 pads of Post-it notes, and I take them to Office Max, and I have them cut them into fourths. So they are strips that are 3/4 of an inch wide, and as you'll see, that just fits in the middle lane in the board. Furthermore, I use a marker, a Post-it marker, and we'll see how that works in a minute. This is not an ultimate system. This is a system for a particular need that I would like to adapt for other needs as time goes forward. There's a timer that I use. I get no promotional consideration for showing you the name of it. And yes, the Army Men and the Millennium Falcon are indeed on my desk all the time. So in the interest of honesty, I left them there. Now, excuse me. So here is an example of the board when it's loaded up from a day's work. The sticky notes represent either tasks, that's the light yellow ones, or practices, that's the light green ones. Let's look a little more at the elements here. The board itself, probably the most prominent ancestor it has is something called personal Kanban, if you've seen that before. 3 lanes: to do, doing, and done. If you turn the ViRAL board on its side, you'll see do, doing, and done. So those 3 lanes are all present. Let's focus in on the first one, which is do. This is where tasks or practices stickies start out on the board before being worked. Now remember, these categories, purpose under tasks, purposes, promises, and pop-ups, and under capabilities are practices. Well, here you see in the upper left, purpose-driven, promises or duties, pop-ups, and practices or habits. All of those same categories. Now the middle row corresponds to the doing part of the Kanban board. It is where the work is actually done. This differs from a Kanban board though, because it does recognize the role of time, but without tying it to a clock. Each box in this lane, I've highlighted one of them here with a hash, represents a single time box. Now, a time box is a concept that comes out of agile development. It is a period of time of a fixed length in which one, and in this case, one and only one sticky will be assigned. In agile development, time boxes are typically 1 to 2 weeks long. They have a rigid time length, and in my use thus far, I use a half an hour each. Thus, they are really micro time boxes. I have not seen this time boxes used this way before. Again, they have no attachment to the clock, but each one has a rigid attachment to a span of time. There are 20 time boxes here with half hour each, allows for 10 truly solid hours of work. It takes more hours than that, hint, to get in 10 truly solid hours of work. In fact, they don't show emergency interrupts or lengthier stops for needs like lunch, and I've been hard pressed to fill them up. There's only been one day that I've been able to fill all of them up. And with the width of the stickies, it just works out perfectly to have the 20 on this row. So in this system, the scope of a task is how many time boxes it takes to finish it. So a short task might only take 1 time box, even less than a time box. It can take many to do a larger task. One thing I've had to work on in using this system is to try to split work into tasks that are each no more than a couple of days worth of time boxes. But we allow the total scope to float, unlike traditional management where you've got the iron triangle of time, cost, and scope. Here we allow scope to float, which is typical of Agile, and throughput actually goes up. There's many studies that show that. So on a given day, though, we're working along, and then we just try to pick a good place. I try to pick a good place to stop for the day. Now, one nice thing about the system is that within that time box, I'm using the timer, time is going along, I keep an absolute focus on that one task. I do not allow, other than a true emergency, like, you know, somebody cut themselves or something, I don't allow my time boxes to be interrupted. And I've had to negotiate that with people around me. I understand there are situations where that's not practical. But it can be made better. And the more that you can guard that time, the more of a state of psychological flow that you can get into. It's very worth doing. Just to be clear here, time during the day flows from the left to the right. The next lane, then, is the done lane. Now, I'm going to use some Agile terminology here and distinguish between done and done. So done means you're done for the day. So there's a place at the end of the day when you're cleaning up to put stickies, take them out of the slots in the middle lane and put them into a leftovers area. There's also places to put things when you're waiting for something for someone else. If it's short term, it goes into day park. If it's long term, it goes into long-term parking. But done means truly done and retired. And for that, I leave the stickies in the middle lane and I notate them with a red dot. You'll see what that looks like in just a minute. So now we're going to walk through. We'll start from here. The end, this represents the end of a day. Okay, I'm going to take these three items, 2 stickies and 1 marker that are in play. I'm pre-positioning to get ready for the next day. It's a good idea to pre-position at the end of the day rather than put it off until the next day. And I move those into leftovers because neither of those were done. I move the marker back here. Let me explain that. Oh, before I explain that, I'll just mention, I have an area here for focuses for the day. That helps me kind of sort through what stickies I'm going to work on and which I'm just going to kind of leave up in those top boxes for another day. On this particular day, obviously, I was working on my quality course I'm currently teaching as well as this webinar. Now this triad, I could put them up in that upper right-hand practices box, but I just leave them there because I do them every morning, first thing. Each one of them is roughly a half an hour. I don't even use the timer. I just do those and I put the marker there at the end of that triad just to indicate when I'm done. Now the next morning, so I'll take the first thing I want to work on. I move it up into the next open position. I set my timer. I move my marker into that box. The marker indicates the time box that I'm working in, or if I've gotten up and left or something, it'd be the last time box I worked in. So now I'm actively working it. I go for 30 minutes or 25 minutes. Timer goes off. Now, if you use the Pomodoro approach, you take a 5-minute break at this point. I'm flexible with it. It's certainly good for that reset. You remember the judges needing a reset on their paroling. That's kind of what this does. Sometimes I'm in such a state of psychological flow, though, I don't want to slow down for a reset. So in that case, I'll just put it back to 25 minutes and keep going. That ends, ready for the next. Now I want to work on the webinar, set the timer, move the marker, start working, and so it goes. March across. So I worked on the webinar for several consecutive time boxes. ... End of that day. All right. So remember this picture? Let's see where the stickies that were in this picture went. Hang on. Okay, so the stickies in this picture, this is a task. This is 3 practices or capabilities. Yes, they are on the board. And you can see them right there. And then here's what it looks like. So that day I had a lot of consecutive time on the same project. Not every day is like that. So here's what it looks like if you're bebopping back and forth between a number of different ones. Notice the red dots. That indicates I actually finished those tasks. So now you can see why we need something more than a personal planner. If you're going to address all of those dimensions, we need something more like a life operations environment. At least for me, I certainly do, something I can live and work within and make the whole day and everything I'm doing visible. And at the end of the day, I can see exactly what I did, what I accomplished, what I put my effort into. If I ever get around to it, I can do analysis based on that. So there's some good data there. So I've got some objective results. For instance, I have done 30 minutes of exercise every day but 2 for the last 3 months. And those were both early and long travel days. I've dropped 20 pounds in weight and 2 belt notches without even trying to diet, just because of the habitual nature of this. Of course, I've kept fulfilling all my ongoing duties, like my UART course. I recently helped develop one, and I'm delivering one now. I've started 2 major new projects with branding and significant progress, established working relationships with 4 new leaders in those 2 major new projects. I took and completed one self-improvement course and begun another. And I even have extra time with the wife and grandkids. The objective part of this is that they're running up and hugging Papa more, which is really a sweet outcome. Subjective benefits, it bolsters my self-discipline for when I'm working by myself, which is my most challenging time. Keeping focus and motivation on tasks that take longer to complete than I expected. This next one is intangible but huge. I almost can't even explain it, but I have this feeling that I'm always doing the most appropriate thing at any given time, even if it's not the most important thing, even if it's not flowing from the golden circle. I can better field interruptions because I know I have a way to get right back in and regain momentum. The day goes by quickly, my energy stays high. I feel like I'm getting credit for my work, even if it's only stickies on a board. I take a picture and I throw it in a journal so I can go back and review the day. I feel intellectually sharper. I think that has a lot to do with the exercise, but also with the speed of thought that I'm doing now. And I just have more joy of life. And some acknowledgments for where the images came from. And Mindy, I am done.
Great. Thank you, Jim. I hope everyone enjoyed the presentation. So at this time, we're going to open it up for questions. So if you all would, I know a few of you have actually already typed in some questions in the chat box, but you should see that in the bottom right-hand side of your screen. And as you formulate your questions and kind of get those together, I'll tell you a little bit again about here are the nuts and bolts of the operations management program I mentioned at the beginning of this session. One thing I didn't mention, though, is this project management graduate certificate. So this is something that you can obtain kind of through our program, and it only consists of 4 classes. And the good news here is that if you later decide to do the full program, these courses can count toward the MSOM degree. But the better news is that these classes will count toward the education hours needed if you want to take that PMP exam. The last thing I'll do, I hope that you are all coming up with your questions here. A few just reminders and housekeeping things. The final presentation in our Lunch and Learn webinar series for this year will be next month on April 19th, and that is presented by Dr. Carrie Melton, and it covers improving the truck driver job. So that will also be a fun presentation for you. As Blake mentioned, and we've already kind of discussed in the chat box, you can also view any previous webinar video or this webinar video as soon as it's ready. You can view that on our series homepage. And I will also send a link. So I'll send an email to everyone who registered, even if they didn't attend this session, and you'll get that video in that link. So without further ado, are there any questions for Jim? Carol Altum said, very informative. Discipline is an important part of this process. That's where practice of discipline comes in. Austin says, is 30 minutes per slot in the time box section a personal preference? He's still unsure about that.
Yeah, so let me start with discipline. Discipline is important. For any habit, discipline is essential. One of the interesting things about this that I found is this is almost like a meta discipline. So in other words, starting to use the system, when I first started out, I was not 100% consistent, but I just kept plugging away at it. The time boxes, just like they do in agile development, enforce a kind of a rhythm. And that rhythm, you know, it's easier to dance than it is to run sometimes. Hence Zumba. It's a dance. And as I got better at using the system, I got more disciplined at using the system, then pretty much anything I put on the board became kind of inherited the discipline that I had already gained on the board. And it's not like the board was hard to do. I have some gamification elements in here that hit the cutting room floor when I was developing the webinar, but there are some addictive, in a good sense, things about this system. There's rewards that help you keep going. I've had no difficulty at all, for instance, continuing to exercise and to, you know, to eat better using the system.
Jim.
So,
a couple of other questions that have come up is, what is the most important first step for this process? And then you may have answered the next question, but we'll let you talk about the first step first.
Yeah, so the first step, I believe, is just simply to get the materials and start playing with it. I haven't developed for different, you know, for different profiles. You know, I have my own profile, which is I spend a lot of time at my desk. So I'm not very mobile. I did buy an 11 by 17 art folio that opens up into a stand. So I take my time box board with me when I go places. But the main thing is just to get started. And at least in this point in time, you know, use what makes sense to you. I think that the elements that are on the board are all there for a pretty good reason. So maybe start with that and then evolve it from there.
Great. Yeah. There was another question that came in, but it sounds kind of like you answered it as far as how long you practiced this in your own life and what the difficulty was making the transition into that rhythm. This person says they imagine the physical board and Post-it notes are kind of difficult for people on the move. So if you're in the library and those kinds of things, but so he asks, what tools do you recommend for those that are more mobile?
Yeah, so I've considered implementing this in Trello, which is a personal Kanban tool. I haven't gotten around to that because I just grab my folio, I throw my my board, my stickies, my Sharpies in the folio, and I take it with me. In most places I go, even though it's 11 by 17, it's sort of like having a 17-inch laptop, you know. It's a little ungainly, but given it, I'm not too worried about that because I'm getting what for me are massive results. I'm willing to put up with some, you know, some awkwardnesses or inconveniences. You know, it's like I use a lot of stickies. I use multiple stickies in a given day if I work on, you know, say on my quality course, and then I have to go handle an appointment or something, and then I come back and work on the quality course. I just go ahead and write another sticky and show it so I can see exactly what I'm doing and what I've done. Now that wastes stickies. There is waste in this process, but I think it's waste that is worth it. It's that type 2 waste in lean. So that's it.
Great. We do have another question coming in. It says, I work at my computer. If I'm working on a project that takes a lot of thought and focus, sorry, they're moving up. If I'm working on a project that takes a lot of thought and focus for about an hour, I'll get at least 10 emails with tasks associated with them. It's so difficult for me to ignore emails. Any suggestions? I have this problem too.
Yeah. Honestly, productivity experts say turn off your access to your emails while you're doing focused work. Now, some of them will say only one of the world's leading, Brendan Burchard, says only look at them twice a day. For a lot of us, I think maybe that's an aspiration, but probably not realistic. But one of the benefits of a half-hour time box is that if you think about it, I think everyone kind of expects up to a half an hour delay. So if you have to check them every half hour, just be sure and turn it off while you're working. Otherwise, you'll never get into a state of psychological flow. You'll never accelerate your production.
Yeah, I think it is difficult to turn that off. I don't know if anyone out there works for Arvest, but I used to work for Arvest, and they had the sundown rule where you had to, or it was very strongly encouraged that you would answer an email, within at least 24 hours or by sundown. And so I still kind of try to do that, but I know that in today's day and age, especially with students, everybody kind of needs an answer or wants an answer more immediately. We do have one.
Yeah, I check my students' emails oftentimes in between time boxes, just a quick check. At the very least, though, like maybe every 4 time boxes every couple hours.
That's a good suggestion. So the last question is, how important do you think it is to use physical board or paper versus digital media? There are noted differences between writing goals down on paper versus using digital methods.
Fabulous question. I have a friend from Brazil who started out in the early days of personal Kanban in 2009, or Kanban period. Started out on paper. He developed a fantastic social media-based approach to Kanban in Brazil that took off like a rocket. And everybody was, it was 5-6 years ahead of its time. I saw him a few years later, and I asked him, well, how's it going? Is the tool selling? And he said he had gone back to physical media because that's what his clients wanted. And there's good brain science behind that. There's when you have the eye-hand coordination, the kinesthetic thing going, and you're moving stuff, you grab a sticky, you move it. That is, if you can do that, that is much more powerful. And even in industry, people have gone in that direction. Now, a lot of times they'll use, they'll do pictures and post the pictures of what's up on the board if they're remote from each other. So you can't always dispense with virtual, but boy, you get a lot of payoff if you can. And that's
all right.
The end of that comment.
Thank you, Jim. I don't think I see any other questions. So if there are no other questions, thank you all for attending today. I hope that you enjoyed this session, and I hope that you're glad you spent your lunch hour with us today. If questions do come up, you see my email address here on the screen. So please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm always happy to answer questions. And for those kind of industry or ViRAL specific questions, I can pass those on to Jim. I will also send out an email as soon as the video recording of this presentation is ready, and you'll be able to find it on our website as well. So thank you all for attending.